Hello, I'm Silvana. I'm going to be going over a brief description of the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion. Um, Before I start, I do want to clarify that there actually are three phases of digestion. Those three phases are depicted in this image. I kind of wanted to put this image in the PowerPoint because just to give like a good background and to let you know that I'm just going over one of the phases, which is the second phase, the gastric phase. The first phase is cephalic, then the gastric and intestinal phase. Each phase does different things. So the gastric phase, it's basically like a period in which swallowed food and semi-digested proteins like peptides or amino acids activate the gastric activity in the digestive tract. And actually, only two-thirds of the gastric secretion occurs during this phase. And the gastric activity being done in the gastric phase of digestion is like a stretching of the stomach, um, and it raises the pH of its contents in the stomach, which means it's more acidic. So, to start, I'm going to just go over the slides. The gastric phase. So it's a stimuli in the gastric lumen that initiates a series of short reflexes that starts the gastric phase of digestion. So like I just said, when you swallow food, uh, after you swallow food, it goes down into the esophagus and the stomach, and that's going to stimulate everything. So the gastric phase reflexes, there's distension of the stomach and the presence of peptides or amino acids in the lumen. That's also what I just said about the semi-digested proteins. And that actually activates the endocrine cells and the enteric neurons to help the process move on. There are hormones, neurotransmitters, and paracrine molecules that influence the motility and secretion. So those hormones and neurotransmitters are mainly like acetylcholine or hydrogen ions that help it. Um, I also wanted to incorporate this image because it has a good description of the gastric phase. So like over here it says the functions. Now the function of the gastric phase is to enhance secretion started in the cephalic stage, which is the first stage of digestion, and then homogenize and acidify the chyme. And whenever I'm going to say chyme, I mean like the gastric juices and partly digested foods. That's what chyme is. And also, the gastric phase initiates the digestion of proteins and of proteins by pepsin. How long does it last? So it lasts 3 to 4 hours. The mechanisms in during the gastric phase are short reflexes triggered by the stimulation of stretch receptors as stomach fills. That's also what I said earlier to introduce the gastric phase, and also the stimulation of chemoreceptors as the pH increases. So hormonally, the stimulation of gastrin releases by the G cells through the parasympathetic activity and presence of peptides and amino acids in chyme. That's going to be that partly digested food. And so the parasympathetic activity is used during the gastric phase of digestion because one, the sympathetic nervous system is like the flight or fight response. I'm sorry, and that's gonna initiate like your adrenaline rush and everything peaking. But the parasympathetic is to calm down everything and mainly keep your body in a homeostatic level. So, in order to keep our digestive tract in homeostasis, we need the digestive system and the gastric phase to be moving in a slow occurring process. Locally, the release of histamine by mast cells as stomach fills, which is not shown in this picture. The actions of the gastric phase, so increased acid and pepsinogen production, and there's increased motility and initiation of mixing waves. So the mixing waves is actually right here. And you can see hydrochloric acid from parietal cells, the chief cells release pepsinogen, and the mucus cells release mucus. I think this is a good picture representing what happens in the stomach during the gastric phase and how everything just goes through throughout. Okay, so first, food arrives from the esophagus, and that reflex is known as receptive relaxation. So when you eat food, it goes down into your, through your esophagus into the stomach. That's a receptive relaxation. So the upper part of your stomach remains relatively quiet, and it holds the food until it is ready for digestion. And that's where like the metabolism kicks into place. So if you have a slow metabolism versus a fast metabolism, that's going to depict whether or not, or how long this process is going to take, or how long the food is held in the stomach, in the upper part. And whenever we ingest more than we need from a nutritional standpoint, the stomach must regulate at the rate which food enters from the small intestine. So without the regulation, the small intestine wouldn't be able to digest and absorb the load presented, and significant amounts of unabsorbed chyme would pass into the large intestine. That's also relating to the metabolism portion of the digestive system, because this is basically saying like, if you eat and eat and eat until you're nauseated and become too full, that's going to mess with your digestive system, because the upper part of your stomach is going to hold that food, and it's going to hold too much at once, and it's going to mess with the unabsorbed chyme, and that's just going to go, it's going to pass into the large intestine instead of going through the whole process. I also do like this picture because it made me understand more about the gastric phase. So it says the gastric phase, step 1, which is right here. So this is when the distension of the stomach stimulates mechanoreceptors and activates a parasympathetic reflex, like I explained earlier. Those action potentials generated by the mechanoreceptors are carried by the vagus nerves to the medulla oblongata, which is the green arrow. So the medulla oblongata is located near the brainstem, or in the brainstem, and it sends signals throughout our body to initiate what responses we would take in our system. So then the second one, after those signals are sent to the medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata increases the action potentials in the vagus nerve that stimulate secretions by parietal and chief cells and stimulate gastrin and histamine secretion by endocrine cells, which is shown by this pink arrow. And the distension of the stomach also activates local reflexes that increase stomach secretions, which is that orange arrow. And the gastrin is carried through the circulation back to the stomach, shown by the purple arrow, where along with histamine it stimulates secretion, which comes to the next slide. So with gastric secretions, and which is like protect and digest of the stomach, so the lumen of the stomach is lined with mucus. So every time we see mucus in physiology or something, there's a fly. Mucus is used as like a protected lining, or like the mucus in our nose, or the mucus that surrounds the lining of the stomach. It's all just a protection. So the stomach is lined with the mucus, and this produces the epithelium punctuated by the openings of the gastric pits. Those gastric pits lead to gastric glands that are deep within the mucosal layer. And also, I incorporated this picture to tell you the anatomy of the digestive system. So we have the oral cavity, which is the mouth, goes down to the esophagus. How I was explaining, when you eat food, travels down the esophagus into the stomach, and then the food is held right here in the upper part of the stomach. Then it goes in, it comes through the duodenum, and then the biles, and then the small intestine to the large intestine, then obviously out of the rectum, when after the whole food is digested and absorbed, Gastrin promotes the action of acid released in the stomach. So think, why do we need acid in the stomach? To break down food. Without the acid in the stomach and the breakdown of that food, we would have large amounts traveling throughout our intestines, and that is just not good. So This gastrin is actually triggered by neural reflexes set from those action potentials from the medulla oblongata. This is mediated by the ENS neurotransmitter called gastrin-releasing peptide, or GRP for short, and it acts on parietal cells and indirectly by stimulating histamine release. And that histamine release stimulates the secretion. Now we have gastric acid. So gastric acid actually has like multiple functions. The acid in the stomach or in the stomach lumen causes the release and activation of pepsin. So I keep saying pepsin, pepsin. The pepsin is an enzyme that digests proteins. And this acid triggers a somatostatin release from D cells. After that, so these are just the functions of the gastric acid. So I just listed the two functions. The third one is hydrochloride denatures proteins by breaking disulfide and hydrogen bonds that hold the protein in its tertiary structure, unfolding protein chains, making the peptide bonds between amino acids more accessible to digestion by pepsin, which is that enzyme that breaks down the proteins, which all ties in together and actually does make sense. Gastric acid also helps kill bacteria and other ingested microorganisms in our stomach. The acid inactivates salivary amylase and stopping carbohydrate digestion that began in the mouth. So acid secretion in the stomach averages 1 to 3 liters per day and create a luminal pH as low as 1, which is really not, The cytoplasmic pH of the parietal cell is about 7.2, which means the cells are pumping hydrogen ions against a gradient that can be 1.5 million times more concentrated than the lumen. Right now I'm just spitting 2 facts so you know like the background of gastric acid and the description of it. Then we have an enzyme secretion like pepsin. So in enzyme secretion, there are 2 enzymes. There's pepsin, the protein, the one that breaks down protein, and a gastric lipase. So that pepsin carries out the initial digestion of proteins, like it says particularly effective on collagen and plays an important role in digesting meat. So think of pepsin like the main protein breaking downer. I don't know how to explain it. I mean, I do, but so it plays an important role in digesting meat, which is a large protein. And pepsin is secreted as an inactive enzyme pepsinogen by chief cells in the gastric glands. So pepsin, pepsinogen. Acid stimulates the release of this from chief cells through a short reflex mediated in the ENS. Once in the stomach lumen, pepsinogen which is released or secreted from pepsin, is cleaved to active pepsin by the action of hydrogen ions and protein digestion begins. The gastric lipase is co-secreted with pepsin. So when pepsin is secreted, gastric lipase is also secreted, but they both do different things. What I wanted to say about enzyme secretion, lipases are enzymes that break down triglycerides. So the gastric lipase. So what I'm trying to say is that a lipase is an enzyme that breaks down triglycerides, so like the fat. However, less than 1/3 of fat digestion takes place in the stomach, which also holds food and is the before stance before the breakdown of the food. And that's all I have.